The Floating World and the Legend of the 5 Bamboo Fly Rods by Gabe Batson. Chapter 3, Câline. Now my heart has grown to love like a river's quiet deep. John was reading in his office after the last angle of sunset shrank away. The commotion of the day had subsided and Hannibal was crossing the Alps. Hours passed in seconds. John had become a fine bookbinder, though not much was known about him before San Francisco. He had worked at the Library of Congress and enjoyed a reputation as an innovative designer and manuscript restorer, but he lived by the rules of the night, studying wisdom that came to him through the centuries, like a transmission crackling through the radio at a lone outpost at the North Pole. The telephone rang. It was Tim Nigel from the British Museum.
John, I need you to fly to Florence tomorrow. You'll be coming out with Sam and Barbara. There's a horrific flood and the BNCF is underwater. They're trucking out thousands of books, maybe 1 million. It's horrible. All of the history.
What? I can't believe it. It's a tragedy. What could I do? Tim, I don't have experience dealing with that many books.
No one does. The officials may be causing secondary damage with the way they're drying things out. We need your expertise.
36 hours later, John arrived in Florence wearing his rubber boots. The flood of the Arno had swept into the libraries and museums. Priceless manuscripts laid in heaps, soiled and matted, and torn asunder by raging waters. A Herculean feat of resurrection was needed to save the voices of the past, lest they be lost forever, like a scream in a bleak, foggy night. Volunteers arrived from all over the world, joining the locals to dig out the wreckage. They were scraping mud, soaking up water, and loading trucks bound for the drying facilities. The books were unearthed in massive piles inundated by silt and sewage. Heating oil washed into the system and gelatin was leaching from the glues in the bindings. The Italian Renaissance laid in peril. Though the storms had subsided, the clocks were frozen at 7:29 for many days. The gray still drizzled and pockets of fog hung over the city. Conditions were dismal. They lacked fresh water and food. Despite it all, the chatter was cheery and bright and nary a complaint was heard. They persisted, and the grateful citizens dubbed them Gli Angoli de Fango. Restoration began in the railway station, the only place where they could get clean water. The most valuable codices were the first to be saved. John assembled a team for rebinding. They developed techniques for non-invasive repairs and a phase system where the materials unable to be restored immediately had any further deterioration checked in place. Every component from covers, headbands, bindings, and thread were cataloged. Stainless steel sinks were used for the washing of each leaf. It took about 4 hours to clean a book. Among the collections damaged were the archives of the Opera del Duomo with its illuminated manuscripts and sacred music. There were thousands of Torah scrolls and the contents of the Biblioteca del Gabinetto. Heartbreak may have pervaded each day, but eventually the rays of sunlight broke through the large windows of the hall. Near the end of his time in Florence, John was inspecting some vellum that had finished drying when Câline put her hand on his shoulder.
Do you have time?
She spoke in the soft, round accent of a Belgique as she unstuck the blonde curls from her brow and tucked them behind her ear.
Sure, it's,
John looked at his wristwatch. She smiled and put her hand on his arm.
I meant, do you have a moment? We have something for you, a Vespasiano.
He leaned close to make sure he heard correctly. Sweetness emanated with each breath, which she took with her whole body.
Yeah,
He said.
I suppose I do.
They walked off together. Hundreds of thousands of books and manuscripts were stabilized by the time John went back to San Francisco, but too many were lost for all time. 2 years later, John lectured at Berkeley on the evolution of humanist script. Afterwards, at a nice reception, he was surprised to see Câline. He reintroduced himself.
So nice to see you again.
She said. Her skin looked sun-kissed, as if she were cliff diving into the sea. They spoke throughout the afternoon, taking a drive up the hills to look at the city at sunset. He learned she grew up near Bruges, where she studied art before moving to London. She always dreamed of living in the States, so she took an offer to move to California. She and John talked about their time in Florence, developments in their field, and his love of the outdoors, fishing and camping. She laughed and confessed she always wanted to learn. Her father was a fly fisherman in windy Belgium.
Come out for a day.
John said. Câline walked to the edge of the hill overlooking the city, close to a steep ravine that lay below. She spread her arms and leaned forward, threatening to be carried off by the wind. She sighed and said,
John, wouldn't it be marvelous to learn how to fly?
Beside a gravel road over a stone wall built a long time ago, there's an abandoned apple orchard. Follow the deer trail and you'll find a stream with roiling water deep and strong that rise up from rocky banks. Beyond the fish ladder is a chain with flags stretched across the water. This tells where one can and where one can't fish. It's covered with hanging moss and glistening from spray. Walk down the river and find the right spot with a fly, and you could hook a magnificent fish. But don't fall in. You'll be swept, you'll be swept, you'll be swept. John and Câline followed the steep trails into the wooded canyon to the stream. Fed by glaciers, it was deep and fast. Its location wasn't a secret, but it took more effort to get there, so they had the river all to themselves. John assembled his fly rod and gave it to Câline. She immediately went into a 35-foot cast. It had a smooth loop which she held with power and grace.
This rod,
She said as she looked at her hands with a pinched brow.
where did I learn how to do this?
John was checking under rocks along the bank. She gave the rod back. He demonstrated working the fly in the fast water and caught a number of small cutthroat trout. Câline took the rod and made a few casts before she rotated a quarter turn so she was facing the right direction. She cast again, this time landing the fly just above a riffle. The partridge and orange moved across the V and worked its way down a seam which was dividing choppy water from the smooth. Just as the slack line was being taken out, she could feel the rod tighten. Something vibrated the fly. Line pulled from between her fingers.
I think I've got one.
She said.
What do I do?
You know what to do. Strip the line in while keeping a tight grip, but if the fish wants to run, let it.
She stripped the line and eventually brought the fish up to the shallow water that lay beneath her feet.
Ooh!
She said. It was a 14-inch wild cutthroat. She stooped and picked it up and held it proudly in the palm of her hands.
I can't believe it.
She said.
My first trout. It's so beautiful.
That's great.
Said John.
I should put it back.
She said as she bent down and let the fish swim away from her hands. After they climbed back up the deer trail over the old stone wall, John threw out a patchwork blanket and unpacked a picnic of Russian sausage, Rosinski cheese, smoked trout, pickled green tomatoes, and chocolate.
I love all this food.
Said Câline.
What I miss most about Belgium is chocolate.
The last bit of sunshine shrank back through the rolling clouds.
Hurry!
Said John.
We gotta get back to the car.
They packed up and could smell drops of rain on the warm grass. It sped up until John and Câline were caught in the downpour. They jumped in the wagon, shivered. The rain was pounding the roof, and a screen of water cascaded across. John kept a down bag in the car and floated it over them. They embraced as the damp warmth climbed their bodies. John told Câline how he had been fortunate in life before he turned his back on his family. He wound up in the Northwest, destitute and alone. He said,
It was another lifetime ago. It seems so far away from here. I remember standing on a bridge overlooking a train yard. Railroad cars were crashing in the darkness. They punctuated the night, as if to convey meaning to me, though I knew there was none at all. The cold rain reflected the street lamps. It was chain link and asphalt as far as I could see. It was during these wandering nights I began to dream. There was a jolting disconnect between my internal life and the one outside. I remember one night at a concert with lights and pounding music, sweating as I collided in the heat of what must have been 1,000 bodies. I went outside. Steam was rising off me in the chilly air, and I longed to be in the desert, surrounded by the Red Canyon where the land was still as the river and the freight trains rushed by. I imagined walking a path, finding where the sagebrush was interrupted by soft round trees. My crouch became a crawl through the grass with my bamboo rod. I kept an eye out for the rattlesnakes that might be sunning themselves on top of flat rocks. In the shade of overhanging trees were lovely 18 and 20-inch redsides sipping from the surface. In the eddy, they danced with supple fins. Everything looked like it was magnified through crystal.
Hello? What are you thinking about?
Asked my friend Becky from the sidewalk. I'm thinking about fishing, I said, shaken out of my reverie. She said,
Your heart is strange.
She was smart and pretty, but cruel. As cruel as most of the people I knew at the time. I began to realize that many of my friends were succumbing to either madness or addiction. It was a world of astute mumblings about Immanuel Kant while nodding off into self-induced comas. I felt crazy with rage, like a man falsely accused. I could no longer stand by while my life slipped past like a river emptying into nothing.
Câline drew closer to John. She caressed his cheek and gave him warm, soft kisses on the neck. The storm had subsided and the last rays before sunset were glistening off the top of the hayfield. The birds were calling. All was bathed in an amber glow. She put her arms around John and said,
Spend the night with me in the city?
John pushed the drive button and they motored down the rural highway. Câline put Debussy on the radio. She had a blanket on her lap and the heater was blowing. A small town with a steeple in the middle square looked like a model railroad set. Over a swift stream was a covered bridge. John looked over at Câline. She had once more fallen asleep. He said,
Câline, I know you can't hear me, but you were always the reason why I came back.
He pulled into a restaurant perched on a rocky cliff, converted from an old logging camp. They ate chicken and dumplings alone in the dining room.
I'm really glad I came along today.
Said Câline.
You don't think fishing is strange?
No, it's beautiful.
She said.
There are stranger things in the world.
He laughed and said,
Maybe we should get in the river one last time before we go.
Won't it be cold?
I think it'll be all right. Do you want to join me?
She shrugged her shoulders.
Sure.
She said. They climbed down the edge of the rocky cliff. Looking into the dark eddy, John said,
Do not worry. Close your eyes and step in.
It looks so cold.
Hand in hand, they took a couple of steps. She anticipated the chill of the water, but it never came, though they plunged by leagues. Wind undulated through their bodies. Moments later, Câline could hear the roar of a waterfall. She felt the warmth of sunlight from behind her eyelids.
Are you awake?
John's voice was being carried off by the breeze.
Yes.
She said.
How long has it been?
Not long. Her vision was blurry, but she could see his face. He smiled.
I remember now.
She thought. She raised herself up and looked around the circular cliff on the edge of a meadow of flowers spanning to the mountains. Craggy orange rocks formed the steep falls. Everything she saw seemed to tug from deep within. The forest, river, and meadow all seemed to breathe as she did.
I feel like I'm living another life.
It'll soon feel as wide.
They walked to the path of flowers up a winding trail, ascending into the mist.